fries, sandwich. French fries on a sandwich, that's innovation. You have an old abandoned church or a future brewery. If you've ever been to this building before, if this is your first time, you might not be surprised to learn that this is not its first form. This used to be the Connolly Trade School, and it provided educational opportunities for Pittsburgh's workforce for over 70 years, until it closed in 2004. And then in 2015, the Energy Innovation Center opened to help carry the spirit of education innovation into the 21st century. So over the next hour or so, you're going to hear from these esteemed experts in innovation and clean energy, and discussions around how we as a region are poised to be leaders in innovation and clean energy globally. And this is why we have the globe here, because we are leaders here. So today's event would not be possible without the partnership between the Carnegie Mellon Scott Institute, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Breathe Project, and the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. And speaking of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, it is now my duty to introduce today's esteemed moderator, Betty Cruz. So Betty assumed the role of president and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh in January of 2020. Prior to joining the council, Betty served as deputy chief of special initiatives for Mayor Bill Peduto and later launched her own social enterprise to advance immigrant inclusion in our region. Over the past few years, the council has prioritized discussions related to global migration, environmental shifts, and the experiences of women and girls in our changing world, as these three topics, are interconnected as we consider the challenges and the opportunities with each. So with that, Betty, the show is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. If we can give him a round of applause for that lovely introduction. So I'm Betty Cruz with the World Affairs Council. How's everyone feeling tonight? It's so good to see you in this bright room, bright space, that storm that rolled through. I was waiting for a rainbow, but that's okay. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have this timely conversation with this incredible lineup of speakers. The way tonight's program is going to flow, just so that you know, we're going to start with the panel, getting perspectives on clean energy and global opportunity, make sure that that's also localized so we understand the relevance of Pittsburgh, look at the national aspect as well as looking at international levels of intersection. Our conversation is going to run for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn to you for your questions. We also received some excellent questions in advance, so I'm going to weave those into the conversation here. So let's get started. Panelists, Noah, Andrew, Matt, I would love for you to get us going by taking a moment to share with us the work that you do, and really take a little time, ground us on your perspective of today's topic, maybe share a little bit about your journey into this work and what you're leading today, the work that you're leading today. Noah, can you get us started?
Thanks, Betty, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm Noah Gordon, a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. Starting with my journey into climate, I actually came into climate politics from pipeline politics. I was a sort of junior reporter at the Atlantic magazine in 2014 when the US was discussing the Keystone XL pipeline to bring oil from Canada, and later was a research assistant in the German Bundestag when they were discussing the Keystone XL pipeline to bring gas from Russia. And in both cases, the more I looked into it, I thought, you know, the politics here are important, but I think the emissions are the most important thing. And that's what's going to matter to all of us in the long term, even more than dependence on Russia, is do we have a safe climate? Are we facing extreme weather events? Can you get insurance for your house? These sorts of questions. And so I started focusing on climate politics back then. About the work we do now, starting with the project that led to this event tonight, we ran a project called the U.S. Foreign Policy for Clean Energy Task Force. This was a bipartisan group of about 25 past and future policymakers that met in D.C. in 2024 to try to figure out how the U.S. could, to steal the title from the report you see, stop losing the race for clean energy, where China is far ahead. And so we do a whole range of different things in our program at Carnegie. We work a bit on climate migration and mobility, people who will have to leave their homes because of climate change and floods. We talk about adaptation. I mentioned insurance before. You see crises already in US states like Florida and California where people can't get insurance anymore because of climate change. And then there's a clean energy work that I'm excited to talk about today with my colleagues here, where we focus on, supply chain resilience, geothermal, and other technologies that I'll save for later.
Andrew.
Thanks, Betty. I'm a recovering civil servant. I used to be the Principal Secretary for Petroleum and Mining in the Government of Kenya, also the Ministry of Energy. And I come from a commercial background, spent many years in commodity trading. And one of the things that when we campaigned to join government in 2013, one of the things that we said is that we would provide primary school students with an internet-enabled device, so a tablet, laptop, whatever it was. And of course, when we came to government, that was one of the things that we wanted to do. But we quickly discovered that out of the 23,000 primary schools in Kenya, only 8,000 had electricity. And good luck if you're going to have them all internet connected without electricity. So for the first 2 years, that's one of the things that we did, is just try and connect them to electricity. And today Kenya actually does have 80% of the population is connected to some form of energy, which is probably one of the highest in Africa. But it was not part of our plan. That was not the plan. The plan was to get this primary schools connected. And next to a primary school, you have a market. Next to the market, you have people who live there. So we then connected the people who are there. And this is part of the discussion that we're going to have today, is that you need to really find out where the load centers are. Both here, we were talking about earlier on with some friends of mine about Pittsburgh. I'm trying to do some research about Pittsburgh since I'm here, is what are the load centers and how have the load centers evolved? So load centers are very important. But the crazy thing about it is this. So once we had all these people connected, they were still cooking with firewood and charcoal. I mean, it's crazy. So they're in their house with electricity, and they still need to go outside and cook with firewood and charcoal. So how do we get them to new modern forms of energy? And how do we get private sector? Because governments only have so much money. And you can't expect the government to do everything for you. So you need to find out, how do you incentivize banks, investors, the elite to invest in things that haven't been done before. So that's what I did for 8 years. And then I decided I need to take a break, so I went into academia. So I'm a fellow at School of International Public Affairs at Columbia, at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I run a small shop called the Energy Opportunity Lab, which we'll chat about later.
Excellent, thank you. Matt.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Matt Mehalik. I am the director of the Breathe Project. My office is just down the hall in this building. We work to bring people together, grassroots, community, frontline, impacted community members, public health, researchers, people who study air quality data, air quality monitoring, other technology, and policy and legal work to move the needle on improving air quality in southwestern Pennsylvania. Right now, we're a network of about 50 organizations that do that work. You might ask, why does it take 50? The answer is because pollution has been part of the intertwined DNA of the Pittsburgh region for generations. And changing that takes a lot of effort at a lot of different levels. My background is in building networks around innovation to initiate change for sustainability and for addressing climate issues. It's why I do this work. There's an earlier part of the story. It taps into my experience growing up here in Pittsburgh during the time of the collapse of the steel industry in the 1980s. And being very puzzled as a teenager of why suddenly there's 30% unemployment, why the people I played Little League with, their families were moving away to Arizona or Texas or somewhere else. Why, as a senior in high school, our guidance counselor said, don't stay here in Pittsburgh, make sure you go somewhere else. And that's why I lived in Virginia for 14 years. My background is in engineering. systems engineering, which is analytics and policy. And I got interested after, getting undergraduate degree working in the defense industry. I got interested in how complex systems change and went back to graduate school. And that's where I tapped into this idea of how do you use the environment to drive change and innovation. And so that was my graduate research work. I published some very early case studies on how the environment was used as a driver to save textile production in areas that produce textiles with a long history, and by going up the value chain and by making credible claims about products that differentiated them. So that's what drove me. And then I got interested in how to transition businesses. So I moved back to Pittsburgh here and worked for Sustainable Pittsburgh for 9 years, launched the Sustainable Business Network, and was able to get people meeting around sustainability, energy innovation, and climate topics for a number of years. It was mostly in the commercial area. We have successes in Pittsburgh with rehabilitation of buildings like this and our convention center and so on. We went pretty far in the commercial area. Where we've been lagging, though, is an industrial area. And that's also where the big health issues are impacted from pollution. And so that's how I ended up doing this work with the Breathe Project. It's addressing a regional material sustainability issue. It's a legacy issue that requires dealing with past, old, outdated industry and trying to drive it forward so that our region can heal and attract people and grow again and be a resilient place. So I appreciate being invited to the conversation.
Great, thank you. Let's move into the question that we framed tonight's program around, which is what does clean energy mean for Pittsburgh's economy and for U.S. foreign policy in a rapidly changing world? Noah, why don't we go down the line again?
Pennsylvania has always been a leader in energy innovation. This is where the nation's first commercial oil well was in 1859, and the first commercial nuclear reactor, leader in coal production in the 19th century, and now more recently gas. And I think Pennsylvania and the Pittsburgh region has a chance to be a leading contributor on clean energy as well. There's a lot of interesting projects around the region. The airport's really impressive. They've got their own microgrid with a mix of gas and solar. EOS is building batteries, not with lithium, but with zinc that can store energy for up to 12 hours. You've got this company, JM Steel, making these steel pipes where the solar panels can move to track the sun throughout the day. And there are more and more projects like that. There's a lot going on in the region, and also possibly some carbon capture for coal. And so I actually guess one more to mention would be the possibility of storing carbon dioxide in some of the oil and gas wells around here. And the reason it's so important, getting to the connection to U.S. foreign policy, we really think from our research down in D.C. that the rise of clean energy is unstoppable. Some of the statistics are really stunning. I mean, about a quarter of cars sold around the world this year will be electric, either fully electric or hybrid. The peak in sales for combustion engine vehicles was actually back in 2017. 40% of global electricity is now low carbon. The biggest one, hydro, and then nuclear, but solar and wind are right behind them. And I guess to take a headline number, there's now twice as much investment in clean energy around the world as in fossil fuels. It's about 2 trillion to 1 trillion. I guess there's anecdotes that really drive that story home as well. You look at a country like Pakistan, which just in the last few years imported so many solar panels from China that they've almost doubled the size of their grid, basically. And so you have all these stories. It's not that fossil fuels are going away, and we're not here to talk about why Pennsylvania should immediately shut that down, these debates about fracking. It's that the fossil fuel market is stagnant, and that's not the future, and that's not where the action is, and that's not where the state and the nation should be focusing. You don't want to be fighting over this stagnant or declining market with Russia or Saudi Arabia and hoping that LNG exports will still be there for you in 20 years. The future is in clean energy, and so we're trying to talk about it now so that we can make the investments. I know Matt will talk about this later, like in producing steel in a more climate-friendly way, which is good for air pollution and eventually good business as well, because other countries are not going to want to import steel that you make with coal. So it's a foreign policy issue, and I think we'll come later to some of the tools that the U.S. can use to stimulate clean energy within the country.
It's great, and I definitely want you to get deeper into the bipartisan report, so we'll come back to you on that. Andrew.
I don't know much about Pittsburgh, so maybe I can tell you something about other places. Which
That would be great.
it's, the U.S. Has some similarities with places like Africa, and there's some differences. So let's look at the similarities. Are that first of all, the U.S. has got a lot of stuff that you can share from a technology point of view and from the history that you've arrived at this point. I'm just so fascinated that there are so many electric companies in the U.S. and just in Pittsburgh. I heard about Duquesne Light and Company. I heard about many interesting places. And I think there's a time when we have to move away from state-owned utilities. And one of the things that has fascinated me living in this country is the way the rural electrification cooperative movement started. And there were a lot of similarities in Africa and the US then, where you had rural communities, you had huge tracts of land which were not served by electricity, but they still needed it. Our hyperscalers are not going to be data centers. Our hyperscalers are going to be construction, agriculture, and some kind of industrialization. Those are going to be our hyperscalers. So we need to figure out, you've already been down this road. So what do we need to avoid? What are the pitfalls that we need to avoid? And what are the things that we can learn from Pittsburgh? Because if you look at a place like South Africa, there are a lot of coal and steel communities. And one of the reasons why the just energy transition partnerships didn't work so well in a place like South Africa, I guess because they didn't have anybody from Pittsburgh on the committee. Because, it was so much theory. We're going to do this, we're going to give you $9 billion, you're going to move away from coal. What do you mean we're going to move away from coal? It's in the ground, the steel is coming from the ground, so, and by the way, you have to borrow the $9 billion, it's not for free. So we need to figure out how community to community engagement can happen. Because a lot of distrust on the just energy transition. I think there's a huge opportunity for you here in Pittsburgh to share some of your experiences, some of your, honest experiences, and some of your misgivings that you have about the energy transition. Unfortunately, what happens now is that it's the inward. If you're against the energy transition, you're a bad guy. We have to move away from bad guys and good guys into what really works for everybody so that we can avoid the pitfalls and the way communities engage so that we can have something that's successful, that really has longevity, that's not just coming from policymakers and activist groups, but is actually homegrown by the communities.
Just really quickly, Matt, Andrew, I'm glad you said that about hyperscalers. The way some people talk about AI and data centers, you would think we don't need electricity for anything but that. And it's a really big deal. There was just this announcement that Amazon's going to invest $20 billion in Pennsylvania for data centers. That really matters. But I think AI data centers, that's 10, maybe 20% of future demand growth. We need electricity for our stoves and our cars and to run the air conditioning when it's going to be these hot, humid summers. And I think sometimes we get a little too focused on it's AI, it's AI, it's AI. It's like, no, it's for our everyday lives. And so just appreciate you correcting that.
I can comment from the perspective of Pittsburgh. So our region is not growing. We're not adding people. We're not adding the jobs that we want to see happen. There's a certain leveling off, stagnation in our region. And it's because we do a great job of educating people from all over the world at our universities. We have wonderful healthcare. We have really good experiences with exchange programs from other parts of the world. But what we're not doing is growing. And it's because the industrial models that underpin our economy, they don't produce that. When you have a community that still suffers from pollution, that is ranked really poorly, that drives people away, okay? So we need to go up the value chain. We need to be smarter about how we think about energy. Yes, Pennsylvania, we have all different dimensions and flavors of energy here. I think we need to be smarter about how we deploy that. Which niche makes the most sense for deploying which type? And given what's happening with climate change, we can't be lax about the timeline, that we need to be pushing harder for the sources that are less climate impactful. Working with the steel industry, there are today automobile manufacturers that are putting out bids for steel that is low carbon steel because they know by the year 2028, 2029, when they manufacture that automobile, there are consumers that want to buy that automobile that has low carbon content in its steel. So it's already happening. So what does that mean? If our region wants to succeed with flat rolled steel, which appears to be the case given the announcement today about the closing of the deal with Nippon, we need to understand that that's where the market is going, that we need to align our production process to go after that value chain prospect, because that's where things will be 20 years from now, 10 years from now, 5 years from now. Instead of saying, well, we're just going to keep doing things the way we've always done them. So this is not to be critical of people who do things well. It's just the lesson of Pittsburgh's earlier collapse in the 1980s was the time frame when to make the capital investments to set things in a pathway that will be productive for the long haul. You need to be upfront and smart and transparent about those conversations so that we get there, rather than pretending like we don't need to think about those things, or even worse, acquiescing to lobbyists who have no interest in that transition and allowing that to continue to push things in direction where we don't have that growth and we aren't putting into place the things that will help us succeed for the long run.
Betty, can I ask you a question? This thing is something that always bugs me in that, okay, so China owns 90% of all battery manufacturing for automotive. So they mine the lithium from someplace and process it in places like Indonesia, Congo. Then they then ship it in diesel-driven, heavy fuel oil-driven ships, and then they process the battery minerals with coal. Okay, so it's now a green battery. I don't know how that happens, but anyway, so then it comes to that we buy the car and we say, look, we're helping the planet. But if you look at the carbon footprint of that battery, it's crazy. It doesn't make any sense. I might as well buy an internal combustion engine. Is there a market where people say, okay, we're going to, you know, like how you have these calorie things on foods? This is the car, its batteries from China, this is its carbon footprint. This is green steel from Pittsburgh, this is its carbon footprint. Do you think there'll be a time when that'll happen? And people will say, I'm prepared to pay a little bit more for a lower carbon footprint. Do you think, Noah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the EU is already planning to tax imported steel if it's dirty steel with high carbon production. So this is spreading. You can imagine Canada doing something in the future, and then US or Nippon Steel not being able to sell that steel if they're going to keep making it with coal in 10 years. And I have to disagree with you on the battery point. We do have life cycle analysis of the emissions, all of the emissions associated with creating and driving a fossil fuel car and an electric vehicle car, and even when you take into account the emissions to make the batteries, they're much cleaner. So I think that, yes, it's worth it even if you're using coal electricity in China to refine the minerals.
I would just add that the automobiles that most of us drive around today with combustion reciprocating piston engine, they're mostly heaters that have mobility attached to them. They are something around maybe 12% efficient. So if you look at the transportation sector and what energy source powers it, it's almost exclusively petroleum, okay, except for the small growth in electric vehicles. So that is very climate impactful. If you're using a technology that's only 12% efficient, essentially what you're doing is burning climate generating fuel sources in a very inefficient way. So this is why innovation is critical. Okay? It is possible to produce batteries that don't have the same footprint that you've highlighted that exists in various mining techniques around the world. There are ways of accessing materials that don't have as much of an impact, but certainly it results in a product that delivers its service at a higher level of efficiency than 12%.
I want to go deeper. Thank you all for that. I want to go deeper on the report, the bipartisan report that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace issued, which is what's anchoring this conversation here today. The report is titled, How to Stop Losing the Race for Clean Energy. Many of its recommendations are about foreign policy, and you've touched on that a bit, Noah, and as what relates to global partnership for clean energy. Can you get a bit more into detail on what's the path forward, especially in the current political context with an administration that's less inclined towards international cooperation?
Yeah, thanks, Betty. Foreign policy is huge. I mean, we're talking at a time when domestic policy is top of mind right now. Back home in DC, they're discussing what to do with the Inflation Reduction Act and the tax credits from that, and it looks like a lot of the subsidies for clean energy will be cut. But foreign policy tools, that's what we focused on in this report. Tariffs are a small part of it. I don't need to get too political here, but it seems when you tariff inputs like steel that you need for production, that tends not to help. But tariffs could have a role in certain areas, like if the U.S. wants to produce the permanent magnets, you need those in everything from fighter jets to brakes to electric motors. You might need some tariff protection so that someone will actually pay for the more expensive magnets that come from the U.S. But the tools we mainly focused on were partnerships. We looked at all the partnerships the U.S. made with foreign countries over the past decade on clean energy, and you could imagine something like a Critical Mineral Buyers Club, or if the U.S. and G7 partners teamed up and said, okay, we want to diversify where the world's critical minerals come from, so we're going to promise to buy minerals from a lithium mine in Australia to make sure that it can't be undercut by Chinese oversupply. And we also looked a lot at two international agencies within the US government, the Development Finance Corporation and the Export-Import Bank. The Development Finance Corporation has been taking equity stakes in mining companies like the firm TechMet. They took a share in them. TechMet went to Brazil and opened a nickel mine and refining facility. That's something that China does all the time and the US has just started to do. And it also fits into the current administration's agenda for mineral dominance. And also the Export-Import Bank, loaning people in other countries money to hire US workers and use US equipment. They did that most recently for a liquefied natural gas project in Mozambique. You could imagine them doing it in the future for geothermal energy. The US is the best, no one drills into the ground better than the US to get energy. And we have a lot of good workers, we have all the best firms, and you could imagine the US lending money to other countries, Kenya's a real leader in geothermal as well, to hire those US firms to come and build clean energy. So foreign policy is a big, big part of it, especially when you talk about these export markets. We talked a bit about EVs, and Chinese EVs are sort of sweeping the world, and it's really getting really hard for US firms to sell their cars abroad, and so we need to make sure that doesn't happen in every sector if we want to bring back manufacturing to places like Pittsburgh.
Thank you for that. Can we, just as a follow-up, talk about prioritization a bit? So which clean energy technologies should the US focus its resources on?
Yeah, that's a good one, Betty. We didn't think, it's not possible for the US to be the leading producer in everything, and we wanted to see where should the US focus its resources. And we actually had a bunch of meetings with the previous White House to develop this framework, thinking, How important is the technology for jobs? Is there potential to leapfrog? That's a report by my colleague Milo sitting over there. Can you jump ahead to a more advanced technology? Is supply chain resilience really important? Would the country be at risk if supplies were currently cut off? Looked at metrics like that, and just, I mean, to give a good example, you could compare solar power and batteries, right? Both areas where China produces most of the world's products at the moment. Solar power, or making solar panels, is not a great business. It's sort of a commodity. You tend to not make a lot of money. You don't need solar panels for a bunch of other uses, and there are not that many risks to relying on imports. You know, even if the U.S. has cut itself off from Chinese solar panels, but if imports suddenly stop today, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. We would keep burning gas for a little bit longer. We've got tons and tons of solar panels sitting in warehouses. You could get more of them. And so it didn't seem like a great area for the U.S. to focus. And then batteries is a really different case. First of all, you need batteries, and you need them in laptops, you need them in drones, you need them for the military. And when you need to be able to produce batteries to have a mineral and mining ecosystem as well. So the U.S. can't have mineral dominance if it's not making batteries. That's mainly for EVs. And there's also a leapfrog potential there. Like, there's not. Again, we're not going to get rich building solar panels in the U.S., but there's potential to develop new types of batteries. I mentioned some of the ones around Pittsburgh, zinc batteries, iron air batteries, and you also solid state batteries when you can just use lithium, and you can have cars that are safer with much longer range, more powerful. And the U.S. actually has a chance there. This is not a race that's already over, like with lithium ion when China's won. The U.S. could actually compete. So we in the report talk about where to prioritize, and should the U.S. onshore, try to bring production home, friendshore, say, okay, well, we don't want all our solar panels from China, let's get some from Malaysia, to leapfrog, to jump ahead to the next generation, or just to maintain and protect the leadership that it has.
Thank you. I want to pull in one of the audience questions. So whoever would like to take this one, or if all three of you would like. What is the role of subnational policymakers in establishing global value chains for clean energy technologies with partner countries? Sure. What is the role of subnational policymakers in establishing global value chains for clean energy technologies with partner countries?
Do you want to take that?
Huh?
I can take that one.
Yes, of course.
You know, I only see the US as 50 different countries. I know you like to deny that you are, but you really are. And everyone has their own different way of looking at the economy and what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And state economies are huge. I think Pennsylvania is looking at spending something. I heard something that Pittsburgh was going to spend. No, Allegheny County was going to spend $9 billion on some clean energy. I mean, that's a lot of money. And there is an opportunity for the state, the county, to look and see where are these projects? Where are these critical minerals, for example, that are available somewhere else? The other thing that these states or counties have is massive pension funds in a population that's not going to grow that fast. And setting up funds that can, through the stock exchange here in Pennsylvania, invest in these projects. There's a huge opportunity. But unfortunately, we're looking at it really insular. If the federal government doesn't want to invest in critical minerals somewhere else for battery technology in the state can do it. There's nothing stopping the state or incentives for corporates that are resident within the state going to invest in these other places. Exactly what Noah was saying about friendshoring. There's nothing stopping them. And that's one thing that when I used to be in the mining sector, I did a road show in the US every year. I would go to see brokers, mainly in New York, to fund projects in Congo, in Gabon, in Guinea, and they would be very happy to do it. But I think at some stage, regulation took over. And so they had to really apply a lot of regulatory approvals that sort of killed that. And of course, who filled the gap? The Chinese filled that gap. And more they fill it in. But there is no, America's superpower is capital markets. And unfortunately, America does not leverage capital markets, technology, and the R&D that is in this country for energy dominance. And I just find it so interesting that maybe you don't know that's your superpower, but the Chinese have nothing on you guys. So you really need to regulate that.
I saw a lot of nodding heads and smiles. Why don't we stay with you, Andrew? If you can tell us a bit at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, you co-authored a commentary. It's called Energy Opportunity, a solution-centric framework to catalyze energy for well-being, social progress, and development. Could you please explain for the audience what energy opportunity is and how it redefines the local community roles?
So energy, when people talk about energy, we've been funneled into this environmental side of it. And we forget that energy is actually to do work. It's to help lives be simpler, not climate change. That's not the aim of it. It's to make life simpler. So the Energy Opportunity Lab looks at beyond the technology, beyond the climate, how do we help people make their life better? So improve their life chances. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we look at social justice. I know people don't like to talk too much about social justice because it's, Betty and I were talking about it some time back, and we were saying it's an uncomfortable discussion to have. Yeah. But when you give people energy and they're able to use it to become wealthy, they become resilient. So both from an energy poverty point of view in the global south and from an energy insecurity point of view in America. 30% of American households are energy insecure. Means they would have to give up something. I remember at Columbia we had a very interesting experiment where we had a forum, and as you walked in, we gave you 3 coins, and we had 5 jars. So the jars were energy, so electricity, heating, lighting, that was 1 jar. Transportation, healthcare, housing, and I can't remember what the 5th one was. Anyway, there were five jars, and you had 3 coins, and you had to decide which of those jars you are going to put in with your 3 coins. And that's what energy insecurity is, And in the world in the climate change world, what happens is that it's getting warmer or it's getting colder. So how many people can keep their homes at the right temperature? That's what energy insecurity is. Energy poverty is, as defined by the UNFCCC, is the use of 500 kilowatt hours per year. Now, 500 kilowatt hours per year is less than my fridge consumes every year. So it's not much. But that's energy poverty. I said $2 a day. You know what $2 can do. So that's poverty line, $2 a day. Energy poverty is 500 kilowatt hours. So we try and figure out, okay, so we're building this resilient energy system that also helps people better their lives. What is it going to look like, and what do we need to do to create productive uses of energy, and what does it look like? 2050, 2.5 billion Africans, 60% under the age of 25. They all need jobs. They all need housing. Are we going to build We're talking about green cement, green steel. There's currently a shortage of 500 million housing units, basic housing units, deficit. And by 2050, it will be more than 1 billion. So how do we get those houses built using the energy systems of the future? Because it's 2050, affordable housing units. So these are the things that at the Energy Opportunity Lab, we try and figure out how this is going to happen, and so that these people can also have a meaningful engagement in the social, economic, and the political life.
Yeah, I would add to that, I'm appreciative that you brought in that these are difficult conversations that can happen, but they're crucial conversations. And one thing that I really value with the three of you is you have different perspectives that you're bringing in and lived experiences. Matt, with your work at the Breathe Project as the creator of the Champions for Sustainable Network that you touched on a bit earlier, how would you describe the current level of participation among Pittsburgh's businesses for green innovation? Are we seeing momentum? Are we seeing it contained within a few?
It's a great question, thanks. It really depends. There's a wide spectrum. So there are some businesses that are all in. It's the businesses that produce, if you look out the window right along the river there in the Strip District, lots of new housing that's been built here, and it's energy efficient, it's LEED certified. There is a lot of industry that has bought all into green and sustainable. It's mostly been commercial though, and residential. The industrial history of this region and the basic energy firms, they have been much slower. And in fact, many of them engage in lobbying to try to forestall progress. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And so that's where there needs to be this reconfiguration. There needs to be a lot more discussion with the larger firms about what priorities need to emerge for the future. We've experienced 10 years of, many of you've seen this toy as a kid, it's a magic 8-ball, and you shake it and it gives an answer, So our region has been asking things like, well, what should we be doing here? And all sides of that cube that come up say natural gas. Okay, that's what we've lived through for the last 10 years, is no matter what the question is, gas is the solution. And back in 2006, the all of the above energy concept launched during the campaign, during Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. Natural gas is a bridge fuel. It made sense when most of this state's energy was still, for electricity, was being generated by very old coal-fired power plants. So there was a need for that. But to keep shaking that magic 8-ball and the answer to come up gas when we are experiencing accelerated temperature rises, storms, when insurance costs are starting to go up, when we see that Pennsylvania had more wildfires in the fall of last year than typically during an entire season historically, okay? And that's what was happening in California 20 years ago, okay? We could experience wildfires like we see elsewhere in Canada and in the western US here. It's been happening in South Carolina and North Carolina. So we cannot continue to just have that be the answer. We need to be smarter about how we deploy energy. And I think that this is a moment. I know there's a lot of policy difficulty right now, but there's also a lot of agreement about what makes sense, where capital investments need to be placed. You've mentioned capital markets. I entirely agree that that is the key. We need to figure out how to de-risk certain investments so that capital markets show up and accelerate the things that we need to move forward. And if we do that, one of the reasons why we're in the position that we're in is because we've had a very hands-off capital markets approach for decades. Laissez-faire has been really the thought process for the last 20 years. And that's why we don't see electric cars being built in the US. You know, capitalists said that has found, well, that's probably the easiest place to move. And we saw this in Pittsburgh in the 1980s as well, too. Why rebuild a 80-year-old open hearth furnace when you can build a mini mill somewhere else in the world at a much lower cost? So we need to think about how we shift from a pure just let capital flow to wherever it can to a prioritized way. And there's a big range between a planned economy, you know, that gets you called a Marxist. You know, no one's saying that that's where we should be. You know, at the same time, just letting capital go to wherever it wants also is producing some of these problems. So we need to have, this is where smart policy can make a difference. And I think we can have some really interesting conversations about that. And conversations about that also serve to bridge between the US and other countries as well, too. So that's where the international dimension of this comes into play, because different places do different things well. We can find ways to connect those things.
Matt, great points on gas. It makes me think of a stat I saw this morning that shocked me. Oil and gas is only 2% of GDP in Pennsylvania. I thought it would be a lot higher based on the conversation, and only 1 out of 1,000 jobs in the state is in oil and gas. So that's lower than I thought from reading the news and the sort of the talks about energy dominance. And I liked what you said about bridge fuel too. You know, people used to say, okay, well, we'll just need gas for now until renewables are ready. The CEO of NextEra, this big energy firm in the US, he says that renewables are now the bridge fuel. Because renewables are here and they're ready. You have almost 90% of the power in the interconnection queue waiting to be plugged into the grid is renewables. And gas, if you want to build a new gas plant right now, you can't build one. If you didn't put an order in for a turbine already, you're not getting one until 2030. So we've already maxed out on gas. We're doing as much of that as we can. But if we want more power for our fridges and air conditioners or everything, it's got to be renewables and batteries.
Can I also, I mean, on that, I just find it so interesting. I think this thing has crept up on America. Because, you know why?
Well, I would say it hasn't crept up. We've known, but there's been people pushing against that transition.
Let me tell you why I'm saying
That's the challenge.
Let me tell you why I say crap. If you want to buy a transformer, power transformer, substation, switch gear, 4 years waiting time. 4 years. You should be able to buy that thing off the shelf because we've known it's coming. But you order it, by the time it gets through Department of Homeland on anti-hacking, it's 4 years. And exactly what Noah was saying, the stuff that's waiting to come onto the grid is all renewable. But it can't get onto the grid because either there are no skills of power engineers or the interconnector is just not there.
That's a really good point, and circling back, we talked about bipartisanship earlier, and like having transformers should be something everybody can agree on. Whether you want more gas or you want more solar, like we need that for more energy. Let's set emissions to the side, and I think it also comes back to that question about what subnational policymakers can do. Workforce development is really important, so that you have enough engineers and people who can install rooftop solar, which for some reason costs 3 times as much in the U.S. as in Australia. And we have all sorts of regulations, like in Germany where I used to live, not a very sunny place. You can just go to their equivalent of Home Depot, buy a solar panel and plug it in on your balcony, and you don't have to ask the government. And here you can't do that. There's all sorts of things where now that the panel is so cheap, you should be able to make a fence out of solar panels if you want and not have to ask anyone about it. And we aren't allowing ourselves to do that. It's strange in a country that prides itself on freedom, and having a battery so you don't have to get your power from the grid should be something that everyone's interested in.
In my house in Kenya, I'm off grid. I just called my contractor and just called him and said, listen, he just came, he assessed how much power we take. Next day, my panels were up, my battery was in, and I was done.
You must have a big battery.
One area we haven't talked about with regard to energy yet is a question that we received from the audience regarding nuclear power. So what is the role of nuclear power in the US in the next 10 and 50-year timeframes?
Do you want to?
Go ahead.
So I happen to grow up in a neighborhood built by Westinghouse here in Pittsburgh, and went to the Science Honors Institute as a high school student, and lots of people I worked with worked in the nuclear program. Actually, the street I grew up on had an atom smasher, a corporate atom smasher that was built in the 1930s. One of the first corporate, experiments in working with atomic energy. The thing that the nuclear energy boom in the past was built on the concept of, in order to achieve greater economies of scale, you build bigger. And it was by the size of the turbine. So when you have a source of heat from nuclear power, you can make things really hot and build it big and achieve economies of scale. But the Achilles heel was it adds complexity because it's nuclear. And it requires complex supply chains. Okay, in past times, it was harder to control nuclear power with the software, the older software systems and sensor systems and so on. There have been advancements in all of these areas, but it's still very expensive to set up a supply chain and maintain it to build nuclear power. It ends up being among the most expensive forms of energy that you can put online. And that's a big barrier for it. So, but I would say there probably are particular uses where energy is needed that would justify the higher cost. We would just need to be very thoughtful about where that makes the most sense. So clearly, it makes sense to have nuclear-powered submarines for the military, right? Or on aircraft carriers and so on. There are particular applications where it makes sense to do that. Where it's sort of up in the air is at the microgrid or regional grid level. Some of the newer planned reactors supposedly can be cost competitive at that level. But I don't think that's been proven yet, and there are a lot of questions about that. Maybe 50 years from now, that might look different. So that's maybe it's a better solution longer term once some of these kinks get taken out. But right now it's very expensive and a little bit risky.
Yeah, I'd agree with Matt. I'm more bullish about the nuclear in 50 years than in the next 10. I think we'll probably have fusion power in 50 years and hopefully do some good things with that. In this decade, we're not building any big nuclear power plants anywhere in the country. We only build them when the government finances them. That's true everywhere in the world. No one really wants to. And some of these things like what Westinghouse is working on, these smaller reactors, I think that can be good in specific cases, but again, that's not going to happen in the next 5 years. So you see some interesting stories like a 3 Mile Island opening again because Microsoft wants to get the power from it. So you see these smaller cases in the reopenings, but it's not the fastest and it's not the cheapest. And I think batteries will reduce the need for a power source that's firm, as people like to say. So good in 50 years. We'll see what happens in the next 5.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So Abu Dhabi just built 3 nuclear power plants, commissioned in, what was it, 2018, 2019. China's built a whole bunch of them. So why can't we build them? That's the question I'm asking. I don't know. I don't know enough about this.
Where'd the money come from for them to build? Like it's a parastatal enterprise. So the model's very different. So they basically reprioritize how those countries' resources are deployed because they will be willing to pay the premium to build something like that. when you mentioned capital markets before, capital markets try to be more efficient with the allocation of capital. And so there's more risk factored in along all the pieces to build a supply chain, to build a nuclear power plant, and it's viewed as risky. So that's where the barrier comes from.
And I agree on supply chains for sure, but the more you build, the better the supply chain gets. If you're going to build one every 10 years, why should I bother putting the infrastructure and the supply chain? But if I'm building one every other year or every year, then it makes sense. And this is the country that started the whole nuclear thing, you know. I keep telling people that in the 70s, the US built a research reactor in Kinshasa, Congo. Can you believe it? In Kinshasa, Congo, nobody was talking about, you know, all these things that people talk about now. And it was a gift because the uranium from Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from a mine in Congo. So they got this reactor, you know. So I'm not buying it. I think U.S. innovation is better than that.
In the spirit of solutions-oriented thinking, I want to pull in one last question that we received in advance from the audience and start to get your questions ready because Brian will be running the mic and we'll be turning to you. But this question on how can we ensure schemes of collaboration or reasonable competition that enhances the development of the clean energy sector? For whoever would like.
You said reasonable competition?
Reasonable competition, yes. Or schemes of collaboration.
So I like this question because it brings people into the equation. We've spent a lot of time talking about energy and technology, but this is where people come into the equation. So we have to start with what people's needs are, and we need to, if we're having a scheme of collaboration for building a particular solution or technology, we need to be transparent with people about what's involved with making that happen. Because there are, even in nuclear power construction, you know, if you're living in the fracking fields around southwestern Pennsylvania, every single one of these projects, there are costs and there are people that bear the burden of that. And it's really too easy to just say, well, that's just too bad for them. And I think that when that happens, that actually bakes in failure from the get-go. That it's because we are not having those conversations, it leads to counter-reactions, people being motivated to tear things down, polarization. And so if we're going to build these things, we need to have partnerships where people are invited to the table to talk through why there's a justification for one project over another. And that helps build bridges. There is a lot of common ground, and I think that that's where we need to begin to do this. Whether the case is solar or critical minerals or nuclear power, you know, we need to have these conversations instead of having them in back rooms somewhere.